Utami and Mrityunjay Kumar Singh. We are now ready for a very special session once again with Vikram Seth in conversation with Samantak Das on the wealth of inspiration to be found in the East. Go East, young reader. And a heartfelt thanks to Shrey for having made this session possible. Thank you.
An author who needs absolutely no introduction. So let him get his stuff organized. And no, we all know Vikram Seth, the creator of a text which has given great joy to Amrutanjan because of the sprained wrists that have resulted, and as a poet. But what not all of us know is that he started his career as an economist, though he didn't actually complete his degree at Stanford, and spent several years in China, in the villages of China, before liberalization, between the Mao and the Deng Xiaoping periods. He's learned Chinese, so he has a much greater first-hand experience of the East than most of us do. And so I'd just like him to go back to the time, a bit of which you will have read in his marvelous adventure / travelogue called Through Heaven Lake, Travel Through Xinjiang and China. So Vikram, would you care to talk about why you got interested in China in the first place and learning Chinese and living there?
Sure. Is that on? Yeah, it is on. Yeah, I find it, let's just a little further. Yeah, it's easier now. And it's very difficult to talk in great proximity and then at the same time being addressed alone. And if they prefer your other profile, we can swap at halftime.
Wait, he stays there or?
No, we'll change.
Yeah.
As far as China is concerned, you know, my first real sense of China was in this 1962 war, which gives you an idea of how old I am. I remember thinking, oh, you know, these strange people coming from the north and taking over our country. In other words, my first impression was of the Chinese being a kind of threat. And I suppose that lasted through much of my adolescence and so on. And it was only when I went to England and happened to be in a bookshop that I read, I picked a book up off the shelf. It was the poems of Wang Wei, the translations of this 8th century Chinese poet, a nature poet. He also wrote a lot about friendship. He was a great painter and a great calligrapher as well. Though sadly, none of his paintings and calligraphy survive. His poems, of course, do and have been translated. But I was very moved by these poems. I think of nothing like them in English literature or Hindi literature. And although they're nature poets, of course, we've got plenty of descriptions of nature in both Sanskrit and Hindi classics. And of course, in European literature, you can think of people like Wordsworth. But this was in a completely different mode. And I remember thinking to myself, if I'm so affected by these poems in translation, then I wonder what it would be like in the original. And many years later, in fact, after I had learned Chinese, I looked over the book of translations that had inspired me. And I thought to myself, I wonder if I could. I was less impressed by them then than after I'd read the poems, and I decided to translate them myself.
Yeah. And your first book, which was in fact published from Kolkata, called Mappings, has translations of 2 or 3 Chinese poems?
It is translation of one Chinese
one
poem.
Chinese.
It's Thoughts While Traveling at Night, not by Wang Wei, but by his contemporary Du Fu.
Whom you've translated subsequently in 3 Chinese poets and elsewhere.
Yeah.
Du Fu.
Du Fu, Li Bai, and Wang Wei were 3 contemporary poets in the 8th century, and they have a very different take on the world. Whereas Du Fu could be considered a sort of Confucian sage who thought that serving the state as a civil servant was the best thing he could do in life. And it was largely because he didn't advance in his career, luckily. Rather like Chaucer, that we got the Canterbury Tales from Chaucer and we got many of Du Fu's wonderful poems. Chaucer was also a bureaucrat, as you know. But Li Bai was one of these crazy kind of standard poets who roams around with flashing eyes and drinking a lot of wine. So he can be seen as a kind of Taoist sage and or Taoist immortal. And then Wang Wei is seen as more Buddhistic in his attitude to life. So there's this quite standard Chinese trichotomy between
Confucian,
the
the
Taoist,
Taoist,
the Buddhist, and the
Confucian.
Confucian. And they all lived between, say, 700 and 770. 701 and 702 were the years of Wang Wei's and Li Bai's birth, and Du Fu was about 10 years later. And Du Fu died in 770.
But can I drag you
Sure.
1300 years and
Unwillingly, but yes.
yes, and actually get you to talk about your economist self, as it were, because I think one of the most striking passages that you have in Heaven Lake, well, not just a striking passage, in several places he talks about, and remember this is the early 80s, he talks about how you've got two very large countries with large populations, great deal of poverty, and you say that, well, the Chinese have actually handled it better, and you're talking about traveling through one of the poorest regions of Tibet, and you say what struck you at that point is that there was no malnutrition, there were no children starving on the streets, everybody was more or less clothed and warm and so on and so forth. So I want your take, as not as a poet, not as somebody who's translating 8th century poetry, but as someone who's living in the here and now, to talk about your experiences of China and also why you've never been back after a certain time.
Well, I'll start with the last bit. I never went back to China after the incident of Tiananmen, where crowds of peaceful protesters were mowed down, and yet I would say that it was in the aftermath of that event that I decided to translate these poets, because the time they lived in, China was undergoing a great civil war with a lot of death and a lot of destruction. One of Du Fu's sons died through starvation and separation. So it was, in a sense, consoling to know that in times of great sorrow and tragedy and suffering, these poems, which were written then, would also be able to comfort and console Chinese people living through difficult times now. And given the nature of the script, the Chinese script, these poems can still be read, whereas for us it might be quite difficult to read, say, even the poems, I don't know, of Surdas or of not Shakespeare, but say Chaucer. For the Chinese, because of the nature of the script, it continues to be readable, even if the pronunciation has changed. And indeed, some of the rhymes, although they've changed, have remained rhymes because they've changed in parallel. But to address the question of how, as I traveled hitchhiking through Tibet, the permission for which I actually only got because I sang an Indian film song, Avara, which movie is very popular, or was very popular in China, one of only 4 Indian movies that was shown again and again. As I was traveling through Tibet and other parts of China, I did notice poverty, but I didn't notice the kind of immiseration that we had in India at that time. And I made generalizations, perhaps only partly as an economist, but just as a general traveler and as a citizen of my country, going through less visited parts of another country. I would say, though, that I did correct some aspects of this later, because at that time, I was an economist and a demographer, and I was doing research in the Chinese villages. And some of the troubling stuff that I noticed was the excess number of deaths over a certain particular period that had happened in China, from say 1959 to 1962 or so. And of course, this was just on the basis of some village data, a few villages. But when the later census in China, the first in 30 years, was published, it became very clear that there had been absolutely terrible famines in China during those years. Famines which were exacerbated by... Sorry, I thought... if at any point you can't hear me at the back, please shout, okay, because it may be that inadvertently I've turned something off. Um, these terrible famines had been exacerbated by official policy and by official lack of information. Not having a free press, having cadres who tried to please people at the center by reports of overproduction, more food was requisitioned from the villages and from the countryside and taken into the cities. And even some food was exported at a time when people were suffering from incredible deprivation. And the news was simply not getting out. It wasn't even getting out to the higher party, the middle-ranking party leaders, because everyone thought that they would lose their prerogatives as a sub-official if they reported underproduction. Now, this led to the death of between, if you can get your heads around this, 15 to 30 million people. So perhaps my first description needed to be adjusted, and in fact, in an interview, in a preface that I wrote to a later edition of From Heaven Lake, around the time of Tiananmen, in fact, I do mention this fact. But in the early 80s, we simply didn't know it. So there are good things, obviously, that China has done, and I'd say also, particularly in the question of health, for example.
Education.
Health, education, I would say simply in terms of longevity. But there are very serious problems, one of which, of course, is the environmental pollution, freedom of speech, and, of course, worst of all, but this won't happen in China now, I don't think, this terrible business of the famine that happened then. Right. Now, of course, the news will get out simply by social media, if nothing else.
Right, right. But if I can sort of try and come back to literature.
You took me away from literature.
I'll take you out and bring you back in, playing you like a fish on a line. But so, which when you say look east, there's not just the spatial component of looking east, but which time do you think one should look at? Contemporary things that are happening, because China has an enormous cultural influence which is growing day by day. I mean, half the stuff that we use is Chinese, the markets which have been blanked by Chinese stuff on the one hand.
But that doesn't mean a cultural influence.
Right.
That means it's got a huge economic
influence. But you can't separate the two, can you really? I mean...
yes and no, actually. Okay. Because it seems to me that though the Chinese are a very nationalistic people, they are also desperately keen to prove their modernity in Western terms, for example. Right. So, and one can also say you can't separate economics from politics. The Chinese seem to have managed to some extent to do that. Right. Enrichez-vous, but don't upset the balance of power. We've got the monopoly of power, the Communist Party of China has. Also in terms of law, there are more executions in China than in, I'd say, the rest of the world put together annually. On the other hand, you can say that in certain respects, for example, the decriminalization of homosexuality, China and Russia are far ahead of us. Right. We've just gone the other way around. So it's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag. I mean, basically, law, politics, economics, freedom of speech. One cannot really say, oh, well, India's doing better or China's doing better. China might have a faster growth rate now, but they're building up a terrible amount of pollution. Absolutely. As well. And one doesn't know about this business of large dams. And of course, exactly, there you can just brutally tell people, get out. Protests simply won't be put up with.
Right. No, but I was thinking, which China? So your 8th century China, is that what you're asking us to look at?
I'm not asking anyone to look at anything. Basically, it's not compulsory to look at China or to look at anything. I blundered or stumbled into it, and I did it out of curiosity and pleasure in the first instance. And only later did I feel that I'd learned a lot. And
so what did you learn?
Well, I think basically many aspects of how individuality and humanity and art and literature can coexist with a brutal and repressive system, at least in the gaps, and how people try to struggle and make their lives with their families somehow the center of their world, uh, while realizing that, serving the state or whatever it is a very dangerous, though a powerful
Occupation.
occupation.
Yeah.
That is why, for example, I would say that the great Cultural Revolution was such a terrible business, because there, the Chinese being very family-oriented people, their children were forced to denounce their parents, husbands were forced to denounce their wives, suicides were rife. It was a bitter and a cruel time. Um, and I don't really know. I mean, it for them was a time that most people look back on with horror.
Horror, absolute horror, yeah. But something I've always wondered, because I think of you as one of the great formalists, because you pay such great attention to form. And you worked across a wide range of genres. I mean, there's poetry, there's translations of poetry, there's the novel in verse, there's the novel story for children, and in every single instance, your libretti and the Revered Earth, in every single instance, what has struck me is the fact that you have been very true to the form. You've chosen a form, you've worked around it, you've never, and that's one of the reasons why I love your poetry, all you who sleep tonight, and so that wonderfully structured stuff. Was this in any way influenced by the Chinese, one might almost say, obsession with formal perfection, or
Could be. I mean, my general point about form is this: that form without content or feeling is pointless. But so really, I mean, I feel as a poet, I'm an emotional poet basically. But I still feel, I mean, I definitely feel that to just write something without structuring it neither satisfies me nor necessarily would mean much to anyone else. Aspects of meter and rhyme and other figures of speech do find a prominent place in my poetry, as in much of the poetry I admire. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't like someone like Whitman or many other poets who write in a much freer mode. It's just that it's not necessarily my particular style. Now, as to whether that came from my Chinese contact with Chinese literature, I would say not in the first instance, because I'd already been writing poetry before I went to China, and long before I went to China. But there were aspects of Chinese poetry which helped me concentrate a little more on it. I'll give you one example. All these three poets whom I've talked about, Wang Wei, Du Fu, and Li Bai, they wrote in a certain specific form, as common, in fact, more prevalent in China than, say, the sonnet form was in Western literature. It was an eight-line poem, eight-line form, where the second, fourth, sixth, and eighth lines rhyme. There are either 5 or 7 syllables in the entire poem. And there's a kind of grammatic parallelism between the third and fourth line, and again between the fifth and the sixth line. And then, in addition to that, they have a very complicated structure of tones. Now, you would think this is an impossible straitjacket. And yet, some of the most moving, I would say immortal poems in the Chinese language have been written in this form. And so I would say that taught me something about sort of not dancing in chains so much, but at least not being intimidated by these so-called constraints, and actually making the constraints a source of inspiration. Quite often a rhyme, for example, if a poem doesn't rhyme, you might not actually have let your mind go down a particular channel. And then it's suggested by the number of syllables or by writing poetry is a very curious business. And I suppose I began experimenting with the idea of writing some poems in words of a single syllable. For instance, I wrote a poem called Soon. It begins, I will die soon. I know this thing is in my blood. And again, lately I've been writing.
Or this one, which is one of those eight liners.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, would you
This is called an autumn meditation. This is not in words of one syllable. This is a translation of a poem by Du Fu. At the time when his country was racked by the civil war that I mentioned, and he's separated from the capital and so on. The capital was called Chang'an. An autumn meditation. I've heard it said Chang'an is like a chessboard where failure and grief is all these 100 years have brought. Mansions of princes and high nobles have new lords. New officers are capped and robed for camp and court. North on the passes, gold drums thunder. To the west, horses and chariots rush, dispatches and reports. Dragon and fish are still, the autumn rivers cold. My ancient land and times of peace come to my thoughts. This was in 7 syllables originally, but there's a very short poem called Spring Scene in Time of War. Almost every Chinese person knows this poem. It begins, Guo Po Shan He Zai, 5 syllables. Country destroyed, mountain, river survive. Guo Po Shan He Zai. Spring Scene in Time of War. The state lies ruined. Hills and streams survive. Spring in the city. Grass and leaves